Bef- um, Dr. Ralph Gigliotti, he is the director of the Center for Organizational Leadership at Rutgers University, where he provides executive leadership for the portfolio of signature academic leadership programs, consultation services, and research initiatives. He also serves as an associate faculty member in the PhD program in higher education and as a part-time lecturer in the Department of Communication. Besides his book on crisis leadership in higher education, he has co-authored 2 other books, Leadership, Communications and Social Influence in the Personal and Professional Context, and A Guide for Leaders in Higher Education, Core Concepts, Competencies, and Tools. He also has many journal article publications. The most recent, I believe, would be this morning, where he published a summary of major findings from a study of department chairs across the Big Ten universities. It was published, as I said, just this morning in Inside Higher Education. Dr. Gigliotti is also a national examiner for the Malcolm Baldrige Performance Excellence Program. He is also actively involved in numerous boards and leadership teams, including the leadership team of the Training and Development Division for the National Communication Association and the Board of Directors for the Network for Change and Continuous Innovation. We're very happy that Dr. Gigliotti is joining us this evening. Welcome, Dr. Gigliotti. You have the baton, so I'm going to turn the platform over to you.
All right. Thank you so much. It's great to be here. Thank you for the kind introduction, Lynn, and for the invitation to join you all. There are so many conveniences with this technology that we have available to us. Although as I was looking at the website for Texas A&M Corpus Christi, I was sort of jealous that we are in this, or angry that we're in this condition we're in right now, because the campus looks stunning. The island university looks beautiful. And as we were talking about a little earlier, my guess is that it's a little bit warmer there than it might be in New Jersey right now. But it's so good to see you all. I'm really excited to be here. This is a topic I have been thinking a lot about very clearly because of the circumstances that we find ourselves in. And I so appreciate such a diverse group being with us this evening. I am going to talk for a bit about my research, about the book, about sort of what's on my mind right now regarding crisis and leadership and the intersection of these 2 areas at this moment in time, particularly for colleges and universities across the country. And what I'm also hoping we'll be able to do is leave a whole lot of time at the end of the session for questions and conversation. I'm happy to talk about how I converted a dissertation into a book project. For those of you that are PhD students or PhD candidates, I'm happy to talk about how I survived the PhD program with the birth of my son at the same time and what that was like. And for those of you that are in administrative or faculty roles, I'm happy to talk about whatever is on your mind with the issues that you're wrestling with right now. I might not have so many answers, but I'm happy to engage in some conversation and share what I can from the research that I've conducted on the topic. So this is a topic that I care a lot about, so much so that I have a 5-year-old son now, a 3-year-old daughter, and a baby who was born in March. So March 19th, right when the pandemic was underway in the US. And I've written a little bit about this in other places, but I recall vividly standing in the hospital room after my daughter was born. And here you have this sort of innocent, beautiful, calm at the time, she's now crawling everywhere, baby. And outside of the hospital, they were setting up the drive-in testing clinic for COVID. We were not allowed to have anyone visit us to see her. And it's been a weird few months for her in terms of her worldview and her paradigm, because she hasn't really seen many folks except through screens. And the stock market was collapsing on March 19th. And for me, it really speaks to this idea of opportunity and beauty and awakening that can arise during times of crisis. And I tend to have a really positive outlook, although I write about crisis and crises. And we're going to sort of talk about that this evening. But I shared that I really enjoy thinking about this topic, so much so that my son the other day was sitting downstairs on our ottoman holding up a book, and I asked him what he was reading about, and my 5-year-old said crisis leadership. So I guess I talk about this a lot at home as well. So I want to start with a quick story. This campus here is where I did my undergrad. It's at Duquesne University in the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So right downtown. It's a lovely campus. It's a Catholic campus founded by the Puritan Fathers. And Duquesne is situated at the top of this hill, and it's called the Bluff. So has a sort of a nice suburban feel where you're away from the city. But if you look around the campus, the buildings and skyscrapers of downtown Pittsburgh are in the distance. It's a really beautiful campus. And I had a really terrific undergraduate experience at Duquesne. And my senior year, we were starting my senior year at Duquesne, and I was student body president. And I recall being in one of the residence halls not far from where this picture was taken. And outside of the windows, we could see a lot of sirens and we could hear a lot of sirens. But it wasn't atypical because, again, we were downtown in the middle of the city. Our phones started to ring quite frequently from the room that we were in, and we soon learned that there was a shooting on campus where 5 student athletes were shot as they were leaving an on-campus dance. And the shooting was caused by visitors to the campus who were not affiliated with the university. And it was a really, really awful situation for, of course, the victims who all survived the accident, and for their families, and for the campus, especially since it was an unprecedented event for the campus. And it led to a whole lot of soul searching across the university around how we could recover from the crisis, how we could heal the wounds and the divisions. There were some underlying diversity and equity issues that were being discussed at the time of the crisis. And we talked a lot about what it means to draw upon, in the words of the president at the time at the university, a reservoir of goodwill that we could pull from to cope with the issue at hand and to recover stronger from the crisis. And for me, folks, that ended up being a window into crisis leadership at a university that set me on a career and set me in pursuit of studying this more deeply in my master's work at Villanova and then my doctoral work at Rutgers. As Lynn mentioned, I am the director of the Center for Organizational Leadership. We are an active research center at the university that reports to our executive vice president for academic affairs. And we like to talk about our role as being a hub for academic leadership development, consultation, and research. So we do a lot of programming for faculty and staff and doctoral students across the university in the area of academic leadership development. We also will work with units and departments on strategic planning and priority setting and change leadership and crisis leadership. And as Lynn was suggesting in her comments, we do a lot of research as well. So the piece, I'll hopefully have a little bit of time at the end of the presentation to talk about the challenges posed by COVID-19 for those who occupy the role of department chair. And I don't know if we have department chairs in the audience now, but those are really complex roles to begin with during normal times. There's sort of a lot of ambiguity and there's a liminality associated with the role where you're sort of caught between the forces of faculty and administration. And then you layer on a global pandemic and it complicates the roles even further. So we do a lot of research that then feeds back into the programs that we provide. So I think about a lot of these topics from an applied perspective. And you'll see from some of the books that we've worked on in the center, my interests really lie at the intersection of leadership and communication and crisis within the context of higher education more broadly. And we're now working on a book on leadership in academic health centers that we will use for our academic health center faculty leadership program. So to begin, I am going to minimize the one of my screens here. So if anyone poses a question in the chat room, hopefully, Lynn, you could just let me know in case I miss it. And again, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end of the presentation as well. So making sense of contemporary crises is where I want to begin. This idea of crisis is an interesting one, and it's a ubiquitous term. It's widely invoked. And prior to the pandemic, it felt as if we were in this sort of perpetual state of crisis in higher education, where there were lots of threats to the work we were doing and critiques to the work we were doing. We were facing lots of budget issues in the making at some of our universities, varying degrees of public perception of the work that we do. And you read through Inside Higher Ed or the Chronicle of Higher Ed, and it felt as if higher education was in a state of crisis. And then we are dealing now with the global pandemic, and that has just amplified these forces that were already at play, and it has threatened so much of the work that we do in higher education. There is a general agreement that crises disrupt and derail organizational practices, that crises threaten the reputations of individual leaders and organizations, and that crises require a rapid response. For my dissertation project and for the work that I've done since then, I was really interested in exploring further this idea of crisis as a social construction. So how do we differentiate a crisis from a non-crisis or a potential crisis? And as I learned from my interviews with several senior leaders from different universities, this idea of crisis often lies in the eye of the beholder. With that being said, the ability to make sense of crisis situations remains a core leadership imperative. And it's important also for the many stakeholders who engage in the activities of organizational life: our students, our alumni, our parents, our benefactors, and donors, for some universities, local and regional and state governments, etc. In one of the papers I worked on recently, I highlighted 3 cases where some were invoking the word crisis to characterize them. And in other cases, there were those who disagreed, that perhaps it didn't rise to the level of crisis. The first is the case at the University of Missouri, where a number of racially charged incidents led to a number of public protests, including a hunger strike and an outcry from the football team. And that was inspired by acts of racial injustice in the nearby Ferguson region. In the second case, there was the debate over the statue of Silent Sam at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And this statue, that in the eyes of some was an important marker of the university's history and the university's heritage, and it deserved prominent placement at the entrance to the flagship campus. Whereas for others, it's a symbol of a moment in time that does not merit inclusion on the flagship campus. And it's a symbol of pain and of harm and of damage. And then at the University of Missouri, there was the really awful and unfortunate death of a student athlete, Jordan McNair. And some were writing about this toxic athletics culture at the university, and that there was a crisis in the making, whereas others viewed it and treated it as an isolated incident. In these cases, there's something at play here, where those who occupy positions of leadership at times can perceive crises in fundamentally different ways than others, such as students, who might view the crisis or sets of crises through different lenses. Now, we compare those examples with the COVID-19 pandemic, for instance. I think you will be hard to find someone who isn't willing to classify what we're going through right now and what we've been going through over these last 7-8 months as an awful crisis. We look at widespread physical destruction in the aftermath of major natural disasters, such as the impact of Hurricane Maria at the University of Puerto Rico or Hurricane Florence at UNC Wilmington. We look at the sexual abuse scandals at Penn State and Michigan State. These examples threaten the reputation of the institution. They disrupt our core mission, and they place a prominent spotlight. They shine this spotlight on the behaviors of those engaged in leadership across the institution. What makes what we're dealing with right now with the pandemic so striking and so unsettling and so concerning is just the length of time that we've been in this and the uncertainty that it has posed for all the work that we do. Not one department at our universities has not been impacted by the crisis. And what's particularly interesting when we think about organizational learning, in March and in April, colleges and universities, you sort of had this feeling we're looking around and seeing what others were doing, and we're responding to the crisis at hand. And we all pivoted quite quickly into this fully online environment. And I think there's something that we should be proud of in how we responded to that. But now what's different is universities are responding in different ways to the crises at play. And there are important reputational implications at stake. And of course, the implications on human lives that are impacted by the virus. So we find ourselves now at this truly historic moment in time where we are dealing with a convergence and a collision of crises. Crises posed by the pandemic, crises posed by this national reckoning of racial justice across our country, climate change, the economy, political debates that are far from ordinary, and we're left with what Carl Weick might refer to as a cosmology episode, where there is a true collapse in sense making. How do we begin to make sense of this moment in time, especially for those of us that have been personally impacted in dramatic ways by any of these crises? If you've lost someone to the virus, if you've lost a home or some property or a loved one because of the impact of climate change, if you've been furloughed from your job because of the economy, or if you come from an underrepresented background and are witnessing what's happening across this country with great pride and with great fear. This is an important moment in time, and it's a moment of crisis. So what I want to do with the next set of slides here is highlight some of the literature that I build upon in the book to offer some commentary on crisis leadership and what I understand crisis leadership to be and what I understand it to mean. So my PhD is in communication. I come at this from a communication perspective. And according to one of the seminal scholars in the field, Tim Coombs, crises are unpredictable phenomena, yet not unexpected. Now, as Lynn held out my book, I'm ashamed to acknowledge that if you go through the book and read it line by line, it makes for great bedtime reading, as I've been told by some. But I hope there are pieces of it that are exciting for you as you're reading it. But what's really interesting is that I don't mention the word pandemic anywhere. I think now, if we were to work on a second edition of the book, we clearly would acknowledge the impact that a pandemic could have on our institutions. And when we look at the etymological roots of crisis, the two symbols that are used in the Chinese language, in Mandarin, to represent crisis, some have suggested reflect the words danger and the word opportunity. That within crisis lies a dangerous opportunity. And if you go way back to look at the true roots of the word crisis, it actually means a turning point. And it was written from the perspective that in a sickness and in major sickness, a crisis was part of this turning point when you became healthy. And over time, that turning point has taken on a negative connotation. But communication, according to Matt Seeger, plays an important role in crisis. It's necessary for meaning making around what are very uncertain and unequivocal events. Internal and external stakeholders are very much impacted by contemporary crises. And these stakeholders often play a role in the very generation of the crisis itself. And I'll share more on that topic later on. But when we look at crisis as a social construction, we're impacted by crises, but we actually constitute the crisis through the ways in which we talk about it and respond to it. And one last point regarding the stakeholders. According to Lori Lewis, stakeholders enact the organization as the embodiment of their own purposes. Their sense of how activities are related, how people are known, how outcomes arise, and how processes unfold. So stakeholders, through communication, help to create the organization. And so an understanding of crisis leadership, for me, it calls for us to take communication seriously. So I keep referring to this idea of the social construction of crisis. And let me unpack that a little further for you. Fairhurst and Connaughton wrote some really interesting pieces looking at the intersection of leadership and communication. And they suggest that post-positivist approaches to leadership privilege communication as constitutive of leadership itself. So there's a constitutive function to communication, that it actually creates these worlds that we then embody and live in. Bloomer refers to a renewed emphasis on social interaction, whereby participants are developing lines of action in the multitudinous situations they encounter. So if you're not familiar with the social construction literature, it's really fascinating. I find it to be useful in thinking about how crises are called into existence. And I can't really do the topic justice with the limited time that we have today, but I would certainly point you to Bloomer's work as some foundational writing. And if you're interested in the topic, I'm happy to point you to some other resources in the field as well. But for me, when we think about the social construction of crisis, it calls for a consideration of the ways in which human actors or those engaged in active leadership respond to situations and the ways in which they respond to other individuals based on the meaning that these situations or individuals have on them. So to go back to the University of Missouri case, and we've done some writing based on the news reporting of what happened in that case, we have this situation where students who are extremely angry and upset and feel hurt approach the president during a homecoming parade, who fails to get out of the car to address them. And there's a situation here where the leadership response doesn't align with the urgency or severity of the situation. So as I write in a recent piece, if there's the perception of crisis, then there's the existence of crisis. Lastly, before we talk about crisis leadership, what do we mean by leadership itself? Fairhurst and Grant describe how communication becomes more than a simple transmission, but it's a medium by which the negotiation and construction of meaning takes place. So communication is more than a tool. And that was something that really inspired my work in this area. When we look at crisis in higher education, there's a tendency to think about the role of communication as being, how can we spin our way out of this mess to preserve our reputation? And sure, that's an important part of crisis leadership. How can you use communication to deliver messages, to connect with people, to express urgency, to protect lives, and to preserve the reputation? But if that's the only response, if that's the only role we're thinking of communication as, it seems limited, it seems short-sighted, and it doesn't bring attention to the importance of values-centered leadership, as we'll talk more about later. So Grint has done some really fascinating writing on contingency theories of leadership, and that isolate the leader, context, situation, and followers, and he calls those limited. And he encourages us to focus on the role of leaders and decision makers in the construction of contexts that legitimates their intended or executed actions and accounts. Isn't that fascinating when we think about that in the context of crisis? How do we refer to these situations and actually designing an environment, a context that makes what we're doing as leaders permissible? How do we actually construct the crisis to short circuit decision making or shortcut decision making? It's quite a fascinating concept. So this is how we have been writing about and thinking about leadership in our center. My mentor, my dissertation chair, Brent Rubin, we've done a lot of writing together on the intersection of leadership and communication. We've been thinking about it recently as the design and implementation of messages, strategies, processes, and structures to facilitate social influence. So for those of you that are in positions of leadership at the university, you could think about the messages that you're sending out to deliver important content to others, to engage in planning and priority setting. But what are the processes that allow for decision making? What are the structures in place that allow for engagement? That becomes part of the leadership endeavor. And for students that are here, you might hear the word leadership and think about it as something distant from what you're experiencing now, because I'm only a doctoral student. How much influence do I have? But treat the dissertation process as an opportunity for leadership. For me, designing a committee in collaboration with my chair and creating the conditions for us to have open and honest dialogue, to build upon my research, and to also invite others to contribute to that research and to help me make sense of these topics, it becomes a leadership imperative. So leadership is a process, and some of the writing on leadership looks at leadership as a verb more so than the leader as the noun. And that's what a communication lens allows us to do. One last piece about leadership more broadly, and then we're going to dive into what this means for higher ed right now. Barbara Kellerman at Harvard, at the Kennedy School of Government, talks about the leadership system, and that we can't just talk about leaders, but we need to look at the intersection of leaders, followers, and context. And it's at this intersection where leadership becomes possible and where leadership analysis becomes really fascinating. So when I think about crisis leadership, then I tend to view crisis leadership as a construct that's more than, but includes preparing for crisis, preventing crises or risks, engaging in communication during all of the stages of crisis, and the active management of crisis. But more than these other functions, it's about an understanding of and appreciation for communication, for others, for the core values and mission of your institution. And then when crisis strikes and the spotlight is on you and your institution, in what ways are those values serving as a guide, serving as an anchor? In what ways are you building dialogue with those most directly impacted by the crisis? In what ways are you taking care of the perception and taking care to ensure that you understand the perceptions that others bring to crisis situations? All of that for me becomes part of what I understand crisis leadership to be. So before I talk about my study, and I don't want to spend too much time on the research design because I know some of you have already read the book, but I do want to give you some highlights in case you haven't had a chance to read it. Or for those of you that aren't familiar with some of the concepts in the book. We talk about crisis, and I talk about crisis in the context of higher ed as being particularly challenging for a lot of reasons. One, we have a diversity of internal and external stakeholders, perhaps more so than a lot of other organizational types. Social media, as I'll share a little bit later, as one of the findings, was presented as a challenging consideration for leaders in higher education, that these technologies have heightened the voices of many stakeholders who perhaps once did not hold privileged voices in our institutions. that leadership and decision making, again, those of you that hold administrative roles, you recognize this firsthand. Decision making is distributed, and this model of shared governance and decentralized processes have helped us create what we've created. And but they've also, the structure itself leads to some challenges in terms of decision making. And as I alluded to earlier, higher education is and was under siege. If you look at the New York Times today, right next to the Amy Coney Barrett announcement is an essay talking about the financial challenges that higher education is dealing with right now. So it continues to be at top of mind for all of us. Why don't I stop for just a moment and see, does anyone have any burning questions that you just need to raise right now before I go into some of the details from my study? And if not, if you want to just save the question, we'll get to it in just a moment.
I know in the chat box there were a couple of contributions that the definition that you and Ruben had with the leadership is the design and structure. It had a lot of meaning for folks.
That's great, Lynn. Thank you for that. And thanks for those who offered those comments. Okay. So for those of you that are doctoral students or doctoral candidates, I was encouraged to choose a dissertation topic that would be timely and timeless. One that would be fascinating for me, one that would pique my curiosity, one that I could spend a whole lot of time studying, and one that would hold up to the test of time in terms of offering contributions. For me, practice was very important as an applied researcher, but also for scholarship. And I appreciate the comment about public school leadership and APA 7. I think some of what I'm going to share is about leadership and education more broadly, even though the context that I studied it in was in higher education specifically. And at public schools, I studied this topic at both public and private universities. So universities that, for my sample, were members of the Association of American Universities, the AAU. And I used APA 6 and not APA 7. But I've been using APA 7 a little bit more with some of the recent work I've done. So your dissertation is very much informed by your research questions, and to have really to pose questions that you're interested in and that you're excited about and that you feel like could make a contribution. And these were the questions that I used for the dissertation, which I modified quite a bit as I worked on the project. And then eventually these served as the core questions for the book on crisis leadership. What events or situations are characterized as crises in higher education? How do these events or situations become defined and labeled as crises? What are the prominent characteristics of the discourse around crisis and crisis leadership in higher education? How do we talk about it? And what skills, values, and competencies are important for the work of crisis leaders in higher education? And how did I go about studying this? From a 5-year period, 2011 to 2015, I chose a sample of articles from that time in the Chronicle of Higher Education and Inside Higher Ed, along with a smaller sample from the New York Times and Wall Street Journal. And I looked at what the authors were referring to as crisis. So I did a search, a content analysis of these articles, and using a taxonomy, tried to sort of better understand what situations were being described as crises. And over a 5-year period, after I removed, for examples that were irrelevant to the scope of my project, such as the Syrian refugee crisis, for instance, it didn't have anything to do with higher education crisis specifically. I pulled those out of the sample and was left with 1,000 articles, that described a crisis in higher education. And then to study the second, third, and fourth questions, I engaged in semi-structured interviews with 37 senior leaders from different divisions of the universities. And these were schools representing the AAU, both public and private, all within the US. And these were institutions that dealt with one of the crises that I discovered in my content analysis, one of the crisis types. So that was my research design. So what events or situations are characterized as crises in higher education? What did I learn from this question? First, that the domain of the crisis matters. In some cases, the crisis was institution specific, such as the Penn State scandal. And in other cases, the crisis was bigger, a crisis in the book publishing industry, a crisis in a financial crisis plaguing higher education, a crisis of the academic labor market, etc. Who holds responsibility for the crisis? In some cases, it was a specific unit that was responsible for the crisis. But in almost all of the cases that I analyzed, it became clear that crises, as the authors were pointing this out in some of the writings, had an interdependent influence on multiple units. And lastly, who gets to declare something a crisis? And in those 1,000 journal articles and Inside Higher Ed and Chronicle articles that I searched, the news articles that described a crisis in higher education, a huge percentage were those declared by the journalist and not necessarily a direct quote from a member of the institution. And these were the crisis types that emerged from my research. There were academic crises, such as widespread plagiarism or significant violations of academic integrity, athletics crises, clinical crises, a financial or business crisis, human resources crisis. These were crises germane to employee crimes or issues regarding hiring and firing of employees. A leadership or governance crisis. A lot of writing at this time was focused on the University of Wisconsin and some of the controversies that were happening there between the university and the state legislature. Natural disasters, public safety crises, racial or identity conflict, student affairs crises, and technological crises. And under that technological umbrella, I include water main breaks and chemical spills, some of those facilities-specific crises. How do these events or situations become defined and labeled as crises? Again, I'll move pretty quickly through this so we have a lot of time for conversation. But at a high enough level, some of the themes that came out of this conversation: one, multiple definitions of crises exist. Crises are distinct from other events or situations, and social media has a huge impact on this. So this was the definition of crisis that I put forward in the book. That's again informed by the research that I gathered. That crises are events or situations of significant magnitude that threaten our reputations, impact the lives of those involved in the institution, disrupt the ways in which the organization functions, have a cascading influence on leadership responsibilities and obligations across units or divisions, and require an immediate response from leaders. So again, think about the pandemic. I think it meets the criteria put forward here. But interestingly, crisis lies in the eye of the beholder. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. What's really fascinating, I think I interviewed 37 senior leaders. Every single person that I interviewed mentioned the challenges posed by social media. That social media has an important role to play in accelerating, accentuating, and escalating events or situations to a perceived level of crisis. As one of my respondents suggested, I think it's just very clear that the world we all operate in has changed dramatically. Things that 10 or certainly 15 years ago would have flown under the radar, now anybody can become a quasi-journalist. Sometimes I'm asked too, is social media a bad thing? And as a number of the respondents highlighted in our interviews, social media plays a hugely important role in being able to disseminate information in a really prompt manner in ways that with some crises that happened, a decade or more ago, perhaps we're unable to do. You can see this other quote here. We have to be much more sensitive to the fact that issues or challenges can escalate much, much more rapidly. And this person went on to describe how disgruntled employees can put something out there and have this issue or situation receive pretty widespread attention in ways that perhaps wasn't once possible. For the third research question, what are the prominent characteristics around the discourse of crisis and crisis leadership? How do we talk about this as leaders? And this was certainly the most theoretical part of the dissertation project. And let me highlight some of these themes for you. And I'm going to provide some specific quotes from my respondents to bring these ideas to life for you. So the first, and it's an article that I just published on this with this very title in the Journal of Applied Communication Research, if you're interested. The perception of crisis involves the reality of crisis. That crises are said to exist because of the ways in which people perceive the situation and because of the ways that leaders talk about the situation. Look at this quote. A crisis, it's not necessarily some external thing that's imposed on our institutions. It sometimes can be that. Is only flamed by a lack of immediate attention. You have to trust that even if you're the leader, if someone else sees something as a crisis, you have to listen. The second theme was about the framing of crisis by leaders. In what ways do leaders manage meaning? And how do we make things into crisis? Look at this quote I share here from a chief of staff for a president. If I go to the president and I say, this issue has the potential to become a full-blown crisis if this isn't addressed quickly, I want his antenna to go up because my use of that term is intentional. A number of folks with whom I spoke described this as the baggage. That crisis has baggage, the label itself, partially because it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. That the news trucks show up and suggest, oh my gosh, it's a crisis. What they're looking for, and they love to come out here and do man on the street interviews to see if they can get a student to say, oh, it's horrible. Then sometimes we have a tendency to react to that. When I think about the crisis as a self-fulfilling prophecy, it involves this idea of communication surrounding crisis, heightening emotions, attracting greater attention, and creating the conditions through which we experience crises themselves. And as I highlighted earlier, the term crisis has baggage and creates a certain level of additional fear and concern that isn't necessarily always the best thing for addressing an issue that higher ed has to address. So I'm sort of approaching the end of the research project, and I just have a couple of comments regarding the crises that we're in today and some thoughts for where we are now, and then I want to leave the rest of our time for Q&A. What are some of the implications for how we practice crisis leadership? And this comes out of the fourth research question that I posed. A couple that I'll highlight here, and I go into more depth in the book on each of these, that perception matters, particularly as we manage these very large, complex institutions where anyone can help to elevate something to the level of crisis. That perception becomes a really important and challenging endeavor. I wrote about the countercultural need for agility, that higher education is held to the same standards for speed and agility when crises strike as some of our corporate neighbors down the street. But culturally, we're not as likely to respond with that same speed and agility because of the design of our systems, because we engage in thoughtful, collaborative decision-making, because we rely on so many committees to do the work of the academy. And that has been a hallmark for us. That's contributed to great excellence in our organizations. I think there's a lot of pride, as I was suggesting earlier, for how we as a sector were able to respond to the pandemic in ways that perhaps surprised us and our institutions. But there's a lot of learning to be done about how we can move beyond this as well. One of the other ones I'll highlight here is this idea of learning from crises and crisis leadership across sectors. We tend to think of higher education as being unique as a system or a structure, and in a lot of ways there are some unique qualities to it for sure. But we can also learn from crises that other organizations are wrestling with. Again, because when the spotlight shines on our institutions, Rutgers is based in New Brunswick, New Jersey, and right across from the campus is Johnson & Johnson's headquarters. And we learn a lot from how they respond to crises and vice versa. But more often than not, it's us learning from them, and also learning from some of the failures as well. Okay, so that's the dissertation and the book and some of my recent research on crisis leadership. And I want to talk briefly about where we are today, and then turn it over to you all. It's remarkable that we're still wrestling with this pandemic. It has been fueled in many ways by misinformation and disinformation. The loss of life is staggering. The financial impact on our institutions is overwhelming. I have so many close colleagues who have been furloughed or have been laid off because of the pandemic, and some are predicting that there's a whole lot more in store. So it's a scary time. And I don't know how many of you have read Rebecca Solnit's book, but she wrote a book a while back called A Paradise Built in Hell. And I love this idea that she raises. She talks about the ways in which community can arise from disaster. But she suggests that if paradise now arises in hell, it's because in the suspension of the usual order and the failure of most systems, we are free to live and act another way. That crisis serves as an awakening. That crisis, as some have defined it, can be a necessary corrective. That crisis can reveal what's broken. That crisis can actually energize us to solve problems in ways that we may not have been able to solve them before. So there is opportunity for each of us and our institutions in crisis. And I have lots of questions regarding what higher education will look like on the other side of this crisis. We could talk more about that later if you want to discuss some of your ideas, and I have some of my own. But I did want to share with you all very briefly a quote from Rebecca Solnit. She wrote a piece in The Guardian, and it's so beautiful. I just have to read the whole quote if you don't mind me reading it. She wrote about the first lesson that a disaster teaches us is that everything is connected. She wrote this in The Guardian in probably the second or third month of the pandemic in the US. But listen to this language. Quote, "When a storm subsides, the air is washed clean of whatever particulate matter has been obscuring the view, and you can often see farther and more sharply than at any other time. We may feel free to pursue change in ways that seemed impossible while the ice of the status quo was locked up. We may have a profoundly different sense of ourselves, our communities, our systems of production, and our future. That when the storm subsides, we can see more clearly." Wyke refers to the fog, and when we can wade our way through the fog, we sometimes can see things with greater clarity. And I was struck by this poem when I when I read it I think it was probably in April. And although many of us are no longer in active quarantine, I think there's so much to this that's still so powerful. I'll give you a moment to read the poem to yourselves. it's that last part that really gets to me. And when the danger passed, we were able to create new ways to live and heal the earth fully as they had been healed. We don't know when we'll be out of this mess. But I do know that higher education has much to learn, and we've been engaged in a whole lot of learning and soul searching throughout this crisis. And I'm sure for the doctoral students in the room and doctoral candidates, lots of questions about, a reminder for why we study this topic. What about educational leadership are we excited about? What energizes us? Who do we want to be? What are the questions we're interested in? And I think it's a moment for deep reflection for each of us, and who we are as leaders and who we are as people. So my research has built upon this crisis leadership work. I've worked on a few essays recently. The perception of crisis piece is one. The second one was an essay I just wrote for the Journal of Literacy and Technology on what we've learned from the sudden shifts to fully online and early perceptions of crisis preparedness at our institutions. And lastly, this Big Ten department chair project regarding competing perceptions of reinvention. I could talk more about this in the Q&A if you're interested, but the one thing I'll highlight that's really fascinating, there were about 170 department chairs that responded to the survey, and about 80 or 90 completed the full survey. And I asked the question, we're hearing a lot of talk about reinventing higher education. How do you feel about that? And there were some that were very energized and excited about reinvention. There were some that were deeply skeptical of reinvention, that it just meant that resources would be taken away and that their programs would be shut down. And for a good majority of the chairs, many were uncertain of what reinvention meant. But one of the things I advocate for in the piece is that we need to give chairs a voice at the table to share what reinvention could look like. But as the chairs highlighted in the research, they are, for many, very much overwhelmed. And the liminality of their role, where they're constantly pivoting to these different stakeholders, has just been amplified in ways that are unhealthy, in ways that are deeply problematic. So a lot of support is needed for individuals in these roles, including, and I advocate for this a lot because of the work we do in our center, training and networking and resources and community building. Okay, so that is my formal presentation. I'm going to stop sharing here so we can see one another again. Make sure I don't or close the meeting down. And Lynn, hopefully that was useful as background to get us going.
It was perfect. I'm processing everything. So I come from the K-12 background, and so much of when I read the book and then listening to you, highlight some of the points in it, just making the connections to different settings is just so present. And having, the pandemic as, an anchor for everyone, that reinvention, the newest article that you published, you could easily go to the principals and ask similar type questions. But I'm going to turn it over to the audience and see what questions come up. If you have a particular question, you want to raise your hand, or if you want to type it in the chat box in case we get some overlap. This isn't really a shy group.
I like how he brought out that crises are eye openers. And I kind of put a side note there that is crises operate like site adjusters and putting things in their perspective, because he brought out that sometimes it causes us to go back and look at things in a different way, that we hadn't looked at them before. And that's so true. It's kind of like that saying, hindsight is 20/20.
Thanks for sharing that, Chandala.
Hi, I was moved by your discussion about really needing to go to the stakeholders and where the rubber meets the road to inform us on the change, and it actually just quickened my heart. I'm in K-12 education and kind of working with groups of people to try to determine, hey, which direction do we go? And I actually texted my chair and I said, oh my gosh, we've been doing it all wrong. I mean, and I know that, but I don't know how to change that direction. And it just, it brings tears to my eyes. So, what do you do now? And we're talking about kids' lives. And I saw research just the other day that, we already know it's 4 years of a delay of learning, but it's 30 years of economic, gross national product that is changed, just of the people. And it makes me sick to my stomach right now, especially coming back from learning reading. Here we have Lucy Calkins just saying that she's made a mistake or we have to change the reading and how we're going from whole language to this. And it just makes me think about what huge things we have to do now to move and change and touch our kids now. So thank you.
Thanks for sharing that, Kim. I know we have virtual school going on downstairs throughout the day with my two older kids, and it's really hard. It's really challenging, and I think the stakeholder perspective and demonstrating care for those perspectives is critical for leadership across education and organizations of all kinds. Good luck with your work too.
Hi, this is Roxanne Reiniger. I just wanted to share that it's really touching for you to talk about this. I mean, you didn't even, when you were doing your dissertation, this pandemic was on, and has taught me a lot by reacting. What you kept saying, that's what touched me, is how we react to crisis and how we communicate with people. It's so vital and it's so important, because I'm watching people that I thought were strong crumble, and we're trying to make decisions that are what's best for our kids. And in this crisis, it's almost like you see who really has it, who really can tough it out and make those decisions, and others who crumble. And you have to be that person that doesn't crumble, and you have to learn from other people. I'm every day, not one day goes by that I don't call and try to ask somebody, well, how are you doing this? Well, what are you doing about this? And I think that was an eye opener for me also, is that we're learning through this, and we're becoming better people and getting better prepared. It just was so touching, and it was so it's so right on target for what I needed tonight. I just wanted to share that.
Well, thank you, Roxanne. My hope is that once we get back to normal, once this is behind us, will we be able to continue with that care for others, that learning, that listening, that spirit of collegiality? Will we be able to move that forward when things settle and get back to normal? And I'm glad so much of that resonated with you.
Hi, Dr. Gigliotti. My name is Rishi. I'm a doctoral candidate. And I wanted to hear your views on the difference between responding to crises in the short term and in the long term. Because sometimes considering this pandemic and how it's affected higher ed, it looks like a lot of things, even when we get out of this pandemic situation, a lot of things would have changed for good. Things considering related to digital learning and things like that. So at one point, when universities were making this shift to digital learning, everybody was worried about, instruction and curriculum. But then a lot of universities and colleges, especially the ones on smaller to mid-sized institutions, simple things as, some forms are just not available online on the website, and those forms can only be submitted in person. So simple things like that were not part of the bigger agenda, because the focus was so much in curriculum and instruction. So we started focusing on short term But then at what point do we also focus on long terms? Because even when we get out of the crisis, things would have changed completely.
Rishi, it's such a great question. And to me, it captures the complexity of crisis leadership at this moment in time, that there is a need to continuously triage short-term issues that are in front of us, right? The students that are getting left behind, the immediate enrollment issues that our institutions are dealing with. How do we ensure that we are putting forward high quality academic programs that meet the needs of our students and that also keep our faculty safe, et cetera? So there's the triaging of short-term issues, but the lingering question, Rishi, that you hit on the head of what are the strategic opportunities that we are pursuing in moving in this direction? What does the promise of higher education look like? What does the modern or what does the post-pandemic residential campus look like? And these questions that are very deep, that have huge implications, not just for our institutions, but our communities and for future students. And as we're moving in this environment here to triaging short-term issues, what are the ways in which we're charting a path forward that preserves the essence of who we are and what we value, but still steps into the future boldly? Because a lot of these trends, Rishi, were underway before the crisis. And the pandemic has just accelerated this. The pandemic has accelerated so many of these shifts that we were going to have to wrestle with as an institution before the crisis. So I think the question is such an important one, and it's one that I hope leaders at all levels are considering when you're responding to the issues at hand. What are the ways in which this has implications on what we're creating for the future, and what are the expectations for the future based on the response to now?
Thank you.
Hi, I wanted to make a comment. My name is Dr. Bernadine Cervantes. I'm a professor at the university. I work particularly with the principal preparation program. Crisis has been a challenge for us in the area of practicums because our future principals are getting a different kind of experience of what you normally would with the more personalization. Things like our domains that they must concentrate on in our standards are now through a virtual lens. More so when you look at teacher evaluations, normally they would do walkthroughs. Yes, in some districts, they're both virtual and face-to-face, but it's not the same climate and culture and experience that a regular administrator would have experienced. So what we're trying to do in this crisis is try to develop as many experiences or try to find alternatives for them to gain that experience so that they can be prepared. But one thing for sure, I will tell you, the leaders today going through this practicum and through this crisis will be the strongest ones ever, because they have been learning. Their leaders that are being mentors for them, they're learning on a second by second, 10-minute by 10-minute. They're learning about district decisions and communications, the do's and don'ts. So those are the experiences and the lenses we're really capturing and focusing on to prepare them, because they've got an opportunity right now that I myself as a leader never had. So it's a really great opportunity. Challenging, but they are doing so awesome.
It's an incredible laboratory for leadership development for the students, and that's so encouraging to hear, because one of the issues that I keep hearing a lot about from senior leaders in higher ed right now is folks are losing, as one person shared with me the other day, losing the joy in the work that they do, because what gave them fulfillment to do this work, now they're talking about social distancing guidelines and setting up plexiglass and how to keep people apart and signage, and it's overwhelming, and that fire in the belly that they had, they're losing steam. So to hear about it from some of your principals, that yes, these are challenging times, but the learning that's possible, that's very encouraging.
Hi, Dr. Gigliotti. This is David Scott, and I'm the Dean of the College of Education and Human Development at Texas A&M Corpus Christi. First of all, I want to thank you so much for your presentation, this discussion. It's fantastic. I've been a student of leadership myself through my career in higher education. Also did a dissertation, as many on the call are probably also doing, in leadership. So just so many things to think about here. And a couple of things that I wanted to say that really resonated with me, especially as we have been seeing all the changes that we've been seeing, is that I really liked what you said early on about sense making and about the challenges that we're all feeling right now. Just relative to this true collapse in sense making, because it seems that on a regular basis now, I find myself thinking through a situation, whether it be trying to plan and react to some of the circumstances that we have in a way that reflects positive thinking in a way that is inclusive, but at the same time recognizing that so much of what we're facing doesn't seem to make sense at times. And so just trying to think through that sense-making piece was something that I thought was very important. Another that I wanted to get your perspective on, because it's something that throughout, whether it be K-12, higher education, it's very, very important. And we are working continue to work through the importance of, as you discussed, distributed and decentralized type of decision making and shared governance, while at the same time trying to deal with, in many cases, rapid crisis issues and accountability and liability, some of which are at odds in terms of the efficiency or the time frame of which decisions have to be made. And so that's one thing that I wanted to see if you have any perspective on, or in any of your other conversations, because I know it's something that we grapple with from time to time, because we absolutely want people to understand. We want people's voices in decision-making processes, and sometimes things are coming almost faster than you're able to process it in a more distributed way. So I'd like your perspective on that.
Well, thank you so much for being here. And I'm sure being a dean, some of what you're wrestling with right now is just endless. So to take some time to be here this evening, I appreciate it. To the first point about sense making, not only do we engage in sense making in this really difficult time, but then figuring out how to engage in sense giving, where we're able to help others to construct meaning in this moment, is a leadership challenge unlike many others, and it's particularly poignant during times of crisis. I think your second point and question about the rapidity of where we are right now, and trying to build up mechanisms for decision making that are inclusive and collaborative, but that are responsive to the exigencies and urgencies of the time, is remarkably complex. And there probably isn't one right way to do this. I know that for some organizations and departments, if there was a structure in place for this collaborative, inclusive decision making preceding the crisis, it helped a lot in managing this situation now. So to think about what are the structures we need to build to make sure that appropriate perspectives are heard and gathered, and that the lines of decision making are clear. Is that clear to you? Is that clear to the faculty and staff? And in what ways are you soliciting the input of students? The second piece of this is building cycles of learning. So what are the ways, and a high-performing organization does a lot of this, just building in collective opportunities for learning and meaning-making. So it's a lot of input solicitation and having honest conversations with different stakeholder groups about not only how people are feeling, so it's community building and network building, but what can we learn from where we are now, what's working well, and what do we need to do next to be better? And gathering that information, that input, so that you can respond to future challenges. And it might be future challenges related to the pandemic or those unrelated to the pandemic, but you're using this data to inform the ways in which we approach leadership and decision making is so critical. And I think the third piece I'll just add, because it's something I talk a lot about in the book, and it's something we're wrestling with a lot at Rutgers and elsewhere. How do you engage in values-centered communication in these organizations that require a human touch when we're disconnected from one another physically, and when we have to be compliant with the laws and regulations and expectations of our general counsel at the institution, right? So how do you reconcile all of this? And you are probably reporting to the provost or senior academic officer. He or she has expectations, as does the system president and system leadership. So caught in the middle of so many different perspectives, but to know what the department and school stands for and to use that as an anchor for how we respond, we can certainly still be compliant in ways that build up and lift up the reputation of our schools, but do it in a way that's core to who we are. I hope that was somewhat helpful in getting at the point.
Absolutely. Thank you. That was great. I appreciate your response. And again, thank you for being here.
Ralph, how do you feel your work with Baldrige has informed your development of all these ideas and the strategies that you're using?
Kathy, I appreciate you raising the question, because the cycles of learning and high performing organization concept I just shared is a Baldrige principle. It's been really critical. I'm still sort of new to Baldrige. I think I've been an examiner now for 2 years. We have an adaptation of the Baldrige framework at Rutgers that Brent Rubin developed, Excellence in Higher Education. And if you look it up, you can see it on our center website. It's uses the categories of Baldrige, but focuses specifically on institutions of higher education. And you look at what constitutes a high-performing academic department or administrative team or institution, but so much of it has been so helpful in thinking about crisis, having clear purposes and plans upon which to lean, having a clear structure for decision-making, ensuring line of sight between the work that students are doing, the work that faculty are doing, the work that staff are doing, and how that contributes to the mission, and this constant cycle of learning. It's reinforced a lot of what I have been thinking about in the context of crisis. Yeah. Thank you for the question. If you're not familiar with Baldrige, the framework is great, and the EAG framework that Brent developed is also quite useful.
Well, thank you for that response. That reaffirms my thinking about Baldrige as well. I had an experience as an examiner. I teach superintendents and in the superintendent certification program. And so my brain is just scurrying around trying to figure how to put all these pieces together, at the superintendent level and teaching leadership in a time of crisis. That's where I'm going.
Yeah, and how interconnected all of those categories are in organizational life.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Ralph,
Thanks,
we have
Kathy.
a question from Susie in the chat box.
Yeah. Common leadership traits among leaders that are successful. Yes, Susie. In the book, I highlight some of these. And then in the one article, I'll share a couple of the articles with Lynn after the presentation in case anyone's interested. But the one is about crisis preparedness in the early days of the pandemic and the sudden shift to online. One of the questions I asked was, what are you looking for from leadership at your university in the early days of a pandemic of this kind? And probably most of these are not going to be surprising to you. Honesty, transparency, agility, care, compassion, those soft skills, but those enduring skills are so critical. But I've always been struck in looking at these competencies or traits that others perceive to be important and those that leaders themselves perceive to be important. There are so many that reflect the human condition and so many that reflect what might be referred to as the performance of leadership. So how can you be strong and bold and decisive and confident, even when, as David was highlighting, the world around you seems like it's collapsing? And we don't know what this is going to look like, but we know that we'll be here for one another and that our institutions will be better because of it. Thanks, Susie. Are you all fully online, Lynn, at Corpus Christi?
No, the majority of the courses are. Somebody can help me with the breakdown. I think we're 25% face-to-face, but with a lot of the social distancing protocols in place, plexiglass, shields, face masks, and then we have the online courses. So we made that shift along with everyone else back in the spring, and then over the summer kind of reevaluated where we are, and then again in the fall, now looking to the spring.
Yeah. Great.
One thing that strikes me in your conversation and aligning with the book is, locating the conversation around crisis and leadership, but what continues to come through is this sense of hope. And so, I'm a qualitative analysis, and I'm listening to some words, and it is not staying in wallowing within the crisis. It's looking for, as you had shared, those opportunities, whether it's a dangerous opportunity or not, or to reinvent. But it's even more clear through your conversation, through how your lens, it's so present. And I have to go back to what you first shared with us with the birth of your daughter, and it's all connected. The hope for the future and our children. So I appreciate you sharing that. But then throughout the entire conversation, that seems to be the anchor. We can talk about crisis and the communication that's necessary and the strategies that can be employed, but in the end, the conversation comes back to moving it forward, moving ourselves forward in a meaningful and authentic way. So that's what I took away from it. Thank you.
Well, it means a lot that you say that, and I'm glad it came through virtually, because that's certainly core to how I tend to think about this. And I also, it's a reminder of why, for most of us, we got in this work in the first place, right? You pursue a study in education or working in higher ed or educational leadership or K-12, not for the money, right? Like, yeah, we could have nice salaries at certain levels and livable wages, of course, but there's a deeper sense of purpose that calls us to this work. And I think crisis complicates that, but it also, once we wade through this, the clarity through which we can better understand what that calling is an important consideration. And at a really deep level here, with just the staggering loss of life and the rioting on the streets and what we're seeing on a daily basis here, I think it just reminds us of what really matters.
I have a follow-up thought or question on that. This is Joyce Gutierrez, former student and graduate of this program here at TAMU-CC. And so my question to you what are some best practices in navigating narratives around crisis? I think if we surrender to the majority of narratives out there, the future would be bleak, whether it's higher ed or even K through 12. So I want to get your thoughts on that.
Such a great question. Thank you. There's a great book. I'm blanking on the name right now, and I know if I go to look on this screen, something will happen with this other screen, so I'm not going to mess with it. But the authors are Tim Selnow and Matt Seeger, and the book is published with Stanford University Press, and it's all about the narratives of crisis. It's a really great book, and those stories matter. And we learn a lot by listening to the stories of others that are being shared. But what's really important to me about stories are are the ways in which they come from a place of authenticity for the leader and a place of authenticity for the institution. And we're hearing a lot of stories now because we're sort of all in this one crisis together and navigating it together. But I think stories give us hope. Stories give us guidance. Stories reveal what's broken. And stories can help, I think, create the conditions where others can see their place in the plot. So for leadership to articulate a narrative that is meaningful and true to who they are, but one that aligns so clearly with what your institution says that it is I think that's so critical. Because what is your university going to be? I mean, I read your website and it looks, for the Corpus Christi location, the articulation of the students that you serve. And yes, there was a comment on the website about the weather there and how many days of sun you have, which is part of the storyline, of course. But there's a deeper purpose about who you serve and who you are. In what ways can we articulate narratives for the future that are hopeful and full of promise, that people can see their place in them? I hope that gets to part of the question.
There was an earlier comment, and you touched briefly on the study of the Big Ten department chairs. Do you mind sharing just a little bit more about the findings?
Certainly. So the survey that went out to all of the department chairs across the Big Ten, and Rutgers is part of the Big Ten, so there were some sort of selfish reasons to study this as well, was about the pandemic and the impact that the pandemic has had on them in making already challenging roles increasingly more challenging. So the study looks at sort of three different categories. One, what are those challenges that they're wrestling with? And one of the things that I highlight in the Inside Higher Ed piece from this morning is that this list goes on and on and on. It's really endless. One person suggested that they feel like a 1-800 operator, where they are just triaging, to go back to Rishi's comment from earlier in question, they are just triaging so many issues from faculty, from, in some cases, students, from staff, and then responding to the issues of senior leadership. So the challenges are abundant. And for most of the respondents, way more than they signed up for when they took on the role of chair, for many hesitantly to begin with, right? So these are important leadership roles. They're liminal leadership roles, and they're made so complex because of what we're wrestling with. The second piece of it is about this idea of pivoting, that in this condition of liminality, the neither here nor there, where you're not really the faculty member, a full faculty member, because you're sort of an administrator, but you're not really an administrator because you don't have as much influence as perhaps a dean or senior administrator. You're stuck in between, while at the same time being required to pivot to these different stakeholders and just sort of being pulled in so many different directions. So lots of really honest, candid insights regarding what that tension looks like for them, and yet a recognition that their role as a conduit is so critical, especially in a crisis, because they do have the perspective of their faculty. And when deans and senior administrators are making important decisions, to make sure that those perspectives are privileged and can rise up the organizational hierarchy becomes an important factor. And the third piece was about the reinvention idea, as I was noting earlier. Just a lot of it sort of runs the gamut in terms of how people are feeling about the reinvention and renewal of higher education. Did any doctoral students have any questions regarding sort of like do you have any questions about dissertation stuff, or are just general thoughts on that? Because I'm willing to answer anything you have. And this is being recorded, so I can't be fully honest in some cases. I'm just kidding. I'll be honest.
I'm going to put a question out there. You had 37 participants for your dissertation, and that translated over into the book. How did you go? And I know that you used was it the AAU? But how did you make those connections? How did you make that networking? And were they face-to-face interviews, or was it through a survey?
Great questions. I used an initial purposeful sample by reaching out to folks that I knew at different institutions, particularly those in the same geographic region as Rutgers, as a place to start, just to begin to gather some data, conduct some pilot interviews. And because when you're talking about crisis, a lot of these issues are sort of sensitive. You know, if you struggle as a leader in a time of crisis, will you reveal that the core of the story to a researcher whom you've never met before? So I wanted to do it in person with some people that I had some direct or indirect relationship with, and then used a purposeful and then snowball method to then ask them if they could put me in touch with others from their institution who would be willing to offer their thoughts on the matter. So the snowball method worked really well because, again, it almost came across at times like I was a reporter wanting to dig. I mean, I talked to some very senior leaders at very prominent research universities that have dealt with what some have referred to be the greatest crisis in higher education history. I will not tell you which institution because they signed a form that they wouldn't reveal that. I wouldn't reveal that. But when you're sharing these stories, there's so much at risk with that. So to make sure as a researcher, and Lynn, you talk about qualitative research, that you can build rapport and that you can sort of get across to the individual that your goal is to study this and to better understand this. And yes, to protect their identity, but to unearth some important themes that could be helpful for all of us. Absolutely, Kim.
Well, I am the department chair in ed leadership. I'm Jerry Maxwell. And I just want to say that I just feel like we haven't been hit that hard in our department because we have amazing faculty here tonight. Dr. Hammer, Dr. Cervantes, Dr. Edwards, Dr. Banda. I mean, they've made it easy. They are agile and they just really have risen to the occasion. Just have to put that plug in for faculty.
Jerry, that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. That community, I have to tell you, I was sharing that earlier in my response to Dean Scott, but for institutions that had this personality or this community in place going into the crisis, it makes a huge difference. It makes a huge difference to how we're able to work collaboratively with faculty, with students in navigating this.
You had mentioned about converting the dissertation into a book. What's that like?
Oh, man, it was a lot more work than I ever anticipated. When I was writing the dissertation, I never once thought, I don't think I thought once about turning it into a book, at least in the early days. As it started to take shape, I knew that there was something to it that wasn't addressed all that well in the existing literature that I'd want to put out there. But for most of the project, the book wasn't the immediate goal. But I shopped around with different book publishers, and depending on what your career goals are, you can work with a commercial press. And I've published some books with commercial presses and have loved the work with them. But I really wanted this one to be published by a scholarly press. So I prepared the proposal and probably submitted it to 6 or 7 prominent higher education scholarly presses with education lists, and it was rejected from a number of them, which was lesson 1, that you need to have some resilience when you're doing this work. And then the other piece of it was some were not really interested in the conversion of a dissertation, because when you're writing a dissertation, you're writing for a different audience, particularly mainly an academic community and your committee, right? And the book is for a different audience and a broader audience in many ways. So to find a publisher that appreciates the work and an editor that appreciates the work, and I did with Rutgers Press, And the conversion took a lot of time because the way that you structure the dissertation is different than how you structure the book. And there was a lot that I wrote about in the book that I didn't write about in the dissertation. So to be very purposeful with the data collection, so that if you decide you want to go back to the data and pull out different pieces of it for a different audience, that you have it organized coherently. So I used NVivo as a qualitative data analysis software for my dissertation, and found it to be really helpful to just use the codes or the nodes as they're described in NVivo to make sense of the data. And Kathy, that is the book. Thank you for sharing that. It's such a good book.
I have a question from Shantala.
A dissertation coach? No, I did not have a dissertation coach. I had I have my mentor in my chair who was tremendous throughout the process. So finding an advisor who cares about you and your progress is really important and can guide you developmentally in asking the right questions. And a wife who maybe was a dissertation coach, but not really talking to me about the dissertation, but making sure that I stay grounded, because you can really lose yourself in this work. When you start to spend so much time with the ideas, you need to stay anchored into who you are. And that was really important, but not a formal coach, Chandala. And remember, a finished dissertation, or a good dissertation, is a finished dissertation. So once you've answered your research questions, your dissertation is nearing its end. At least that was my experience. So thanks for this comment, Desine. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Desine, thank you. Yeah, I think from a communication perspective, leadership is communicative, and the intersection with crises bring leadership to life in really important ways. And once that spotlight is on you or your institution, it's scary, as I mentioned in my earlier example from my undergrad, but it can really help you become even clearer with what you stand for. We just have to also recognize too, we have an election coming up so soon here. And I didn't add a picture of the sort of political climate to my convergence of crises piece, but it probably deserves some acknowledgement, especially in the great state of Texas, that there are individuals that we can't really talk to one another right now because we're spending so much time talking past one another. And that perhaps lack of civility or lack of trust or lack of care, it's everywhere, right? So I think to recognize the climate that we're in right now politically, and to think about what renewal will look like after election day, perhaps regardless of who wins. But that there's an important dimension to this. I hope you all vote.
So, Ralph, I'm pleased to say I have voted on our campus, and I encourage anyone who hasn't voted to know that voting on campus is really easy right now and really quick. I wanted to say that I really appreciated all of your comments tonight and the very thoughtful way you went about sharing your work and the understanding of what you do personally right now. And so I guess one of my questions is, you really seem to deal very effectively with sort of this idea of what do we know academically and what do we experience personally, and that personally we're all going through a lot. I mean, I think we heard comments from students, practicing administrators, our dean, our department chairs about the fact I hate the term the new normal, but I'm just going to use it as sort of because that's what we say about this time, right? But if you're talking to people about how do we navigate and how do we manage ourselves in these very stressful situations, knowing what we know about organizations, but what we have to do interpersonally to connect with each other. Sort of, what are your recommendations related to that?
Yeah, Phyllis, thank you for the question. It's an important one, and I acknowledge at the very outset of this that I talk about this from a place of privilege, in that I have a job. I haven't lost my job. I have a paycheck coming every other week, and I can spend time thinking about these issues. And I have a partner who lives in the house, who's able to watch our kids and homeschool them. And that's a whole lot more than a lot of people could say right now. So that's an important dimension to this. I think for me, and I think in just talking to colleagues across Rutgers and at other universities who are wrestling with these issues, developing a routine personally is an important dimension to this, because when we shift to this fully online environment for so many of us, it's hard to it can be paralyzing after a while, especially with the barrage of negative news that we might come across on a regular basis. So taking care of ourselves and taking care of others is an important part of this. I also think I've talked to a lot of folks, and this came out in the department chair study as well. How do you preserve the personality of the department when we're going through this deeply troubling moment together? And connecting with people on an individual level to make sure they're okay is huge. Whether it's the faculty member reaching out to the doctoral student, or the dean reaching out to each of the individual faculty in the department, it takes so much time. So to make sure you're caring for yourself, but also that each individual knows that these are not normal times, that if you look at the journal submission data that's out there right now, particularly women are submitting far fewer articles for review, and to recognize the very real impact that has on our scholarship and on the work we're doing. So revisiting some of the guidelines is happening at different universities for tenure and promotion, but looking at the structures of the organization, what needs to change, what do we need to dial back a little bit, just so that we're caring for one another, and in what ways are we connecting with one another on deeply individual levels. Because there's a part of this too. I manage a team, and I've checked in with the individuals quite a lot, and they're actually loving a lot of this. They're loving the autonomy that this new environment creates. They're still doing really meaningful work, but they're thriving. But they all have some, unique personal circumstances that are hard to wrestle with at this time. So to know that you're there for them, you care for them, and that we'll get through this together, I think that helps a lot.
Thanks, I appreciate that. And I really appreciated the presentation. As a faculty member, one of the things I find, I'm chasing my students more this semester than I ever have. But I also acknowledge to all of them, because many of them are practicing educators, what they deal with as people working in pre-K-12 is way harder than anything I deal with working in a university setting. And unlike you, I don't have young children. I have grandchildren that I'm concerned about, but I'm not homeschooling my children simultaneously with trying to, I have a son who's a teacher. He's teaching online and face-to-face at the same time. I think that awareness is really important. So I appreciate those comments.
Thanks, Phyllis. Rosa raises a really thoughtful question. How can one go about advocating for critical social justice as a result of crises? Yes, we didn't really talk a lot about some of the racial unrest issues, but I think that is a crisis that we're dealing with right now in this moment of awakening that is well deserved. If we approach crises as the necessary corrective, they reveal some of what's broken already. And to be able to first, I think, understand what's broken interpersonally, societally, institutionally is important. And to have data to support why you perceive it to be broken, and to rally others around solutions for acknowledging that which is broken becomes an important part of this. Because crises impact so many of us in very different ways. How can you advocate for a cause collectively when we're in many ways physically distanced from one another? It gets tricky, but I think with crisis, as an awakening and as a moment of renewal, to be able to have your voice heard requires you to know what's broken, have data to support that, and to be able to rally others in defending that. And that's sort of a broad construct and broad way that I think about it. And hopefully that resonates with some of what might be on your mind, Rosa.
I appreciate that, Ralph. Yeah, because I think I have the pleasure of teaching at our ed leadership program. And as we noted earlier, a lot of them they're all practitioners, right? Because we have an EDD. So they're in that K-12 and higher ed. And so in addition to Black Lives Matter, right, the idea of the pandemic has brought to the forefront issues of inequities, disparities, food insecurities, health disparities, that we already knew existed, right? I mean, in terms of the region of Texas, in terms of the populations we work with. And I think part of what we've been trying to deep dive in discussions, whether it's policy or leadership or governance, and how different power dimensions play out in leadership themselves. It's really just, in a sense, we're hopeful, but there's a sense of helplessness, right? Because everything's changing so quickly that we don't know the best way to advocate for, students who have to learn online and they require special needs. They require special services, or for kids whose families cannot feed them, right? The use of food banks has increased over the pandemic as well. And so we have very caring practitioners who, believe in the humanity of, they see the children and people as humans first. And I think that's part of what we've been trying to figure out, while also maintaining our own mental wellness, right? Is how do we advocate still in times where you're social distancing, you have a mask, and all sorts of things. But I appreciate your response. Yes, Michael noted digital divide, absolutely.
And Rosa, thanks for that. It's so thoughtful, and the way the listing of issues that you just raised are all so important. And I wonder too, if from that framework, like incremental change is really important. So, you won't be able to solve all of this overnight, but incrementally, how can we build support for it? And what are the ways in which we can approach university administration or whatever the collective body might be, to not just pose the problems, but also to pose potentially 1, 2, or 3 solutions that we could come up with collectively that align with the mission of the university and with the strategic priorities of those who hold formal responsibility. Because the more strategic we can be with this, because resources are tight everywhere, right? And because we're dealing with so many crises, hopefully that can help with articulating a coherent narrative to those with formal decision making.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
You all were such a thoughtful group too. Thank you for this.
Ralph, I'll ask one more in reaction to Jerry's comment, because I'm also a special educator by training, and I would, a lot of the things Rosie just said really resonate with me. But I also am curious if any of your work, or if y'all have looked at how this is further separating, how this situation is further separating the haves and have-nots, and some of your thoughts on how we begin to address that, because I feel like often the students that I'm most concerned about advocating for may be getting actually the least in terms of instruction right now.
Yeah, Phyllis, I thank you for sharing. I haven't studied this part of it specifically myself, but there are a lot of other folks in our School of Communication Information, for instance, at Rutgers, who do specialize in this work, that have done a lot of writing on this issue. And the findings from some of the early data that some of these scholars have gathered is heartbreaking in terms of what this has done in further distinguishing the haves from the have-nots at our college campuses. Who has access to the technology and bandwidth to take some of these online classes, whose families still have jobs that they're able to pay for or help pay for part of the tuition and fees. The impact that this is having is staggering. And I've been struck by some of the recent enrollment data that more students are not pursuing degrees at community colleges. That, you know, in the early days of this, there was the thought that community colleges would go through this boom in terms of enrollment because they were a more affordable option. But it's actually the opposite that we're seeing in some of the enrollment data that's out there. All of that is to say that it's a concern for all of our institutions. I know there are a lot of people at Rutgers that are spending a lot of time thinking about the impact this is having as a state university on some of our underrepresented students and those with fewer resources. And I don't know quite what the answer is, other than we need to come together to think about it deeply and recognize the impact that this is having. That is not, I think it was I can't find your full name right now. Someone mentioned this earlier about the impact that this is having on GDP over the next 30 years, but also the impact it's having on quality of education for young people who are, you know, responding to the crises. So it's so important, but not directly related to my research that I found. Thanks for your comment, Shannon. It was my pleasure being here. Although hopefully I'll be able to visit the island at some point.
Always welcome. So we're winding down. It's about 8:17 right now, going on 8:20. And as we kind of reflect on the presentation, always looking forward as well. So what is on your horizon for some future research? And is it going to be focused solely on the pandemic, or is it going to be having that the pandemic as part of still the crisis leadership overview?
Thank you so much for the question, Lynn. I know when I finished defending my dissertation, the question that was asked was, so what's next? And I remember being full of anxiety with that, because I'm like, oh my gosh, I just finished this dissertation. You're asking me what's next. And I just felt that same weight of anxiety, Lynn, when I just have been writing nonstop and you ask me what's next. And I think I have a couple potential directions here. One, we're going through so much change at our university on a professional front. We have a brand new president who started July 1st, who's really terrific, and lots of interesting strategic priorities that are being pursued. So I think I will, and our center will play a really key role in helping to advance some of those. And I'm really excited by that, the opportunities there. On the scholarship front, I'm really fascinated with this idea of renewal and healing. And I think there are going to be some really interesting cases to come out of this in terms of how institutions heal post-pandemic and how we as a sector heal from this. I don't know if my research will exclusively focus on COVID, because I just went to a talk the other day. There have been tens of thousands of published articles already on COVID. So, you know, I want my work to have an impact, but a lot of people are studying it, and it deserves a lot of attention right now. But I do think how we heal from this is going to be fascinating, and how we learn from this. I'm also really interested in internal learning and development operations at universities, such as centers like my own. How are we responding to crises, and how are we equipping others in building crisis leadership capacity? Because one of the central premises of the book is that crisis leadership development was not a primary area of focus. Maybe for the principals in your principal program, but in higher ed, not so much, right? Very little attention on crisis leadership development. I've worked with deans who have minimal preparation in dealing with crises, right? And limited training for them and for department chairs. And what I wrote about in the book is that given the complexity of our organizations and where we're going, crisis leadership development is going to really take center stage in the years ahead. not knowing that we'd be dealing with what we're dealing with now. So how do internal learning and development operations support the crisis leadership capacity building, and how do universities at large encourage them? So those are sort of two directions my future work might take, and building upon some of these interesting questions.
Thank you. I didn't mean to put the fear but I understand what you're talking about also. But I know in the audience we have some doctoral candidates that their dissertation is going to be focusing on crisis leadership. So I'm not sure if they would want to share out or ask questions relative to the direction they're going, but we have about 10 more minutes before we come to a close.
I'd love to hear it if anyone's comfortable sharing.
Well, I kind of spoke already, and I am actually using your book as a huge piece of my background and information in developing my literature review. I thought it was really interesting about building leadership capacity. The lessons learned, also the narratives, the story. Someone brought that up. In fact, I've been ordering books on Amazon that you've brought that you keep mentioning. So I've done that. I also am really interested in the sense making and sense giving. And also one piece is the complex and chaos, how beauty can come from ashes, and how things are, there's an evolution of something more beautiful than what was before. And it's so funny because I just sat in a meeting right before this one with a general. His name was General Casey, and he spoke all about, and I know I'm going to say it wrong, VUCA or the whole.
VUCA.
Yes. And so I have like 15 pages worth of notes on this. And so, but talking about, how things, are created out of this chaos. And so, I texted again. I was like, I think I know some stuff. I didn't really think I knew some stuff, but actually I do know some stuff. So you affirmed me, and I appreciate that. So
you know a lot of stuff, and that's amazing. The project sounds fascinating. Two interesting pieces, Kim, to add to this. One, when I was studying crisis leadership, one of the limitations I acknowledge in the book, and I don't know if you'll be able to address this with some of your work, I talk about leadership being at the intersection of self, other, and context, but my research tends to default to talking to individuals who are engaged in leadership and not necessarily the perspectives of those who are impacted by the leadership. So if there's a way to study crisis leadership, but more holistically, so you're getting different perspectives, I don't know if that will support the work you do, but it's important for the scholarship.
Well,
and I just have
you mentioned that earlier, and I was thinking, so like, how do you interview the people that are affected by the people that are making the decisions, right?
Huge. Yes, especially if you understand leadership broadly like that, right? And I just have to share this because you mentioned VUCA. I heard a brilliant presentation from our new Chief of Staff and Senior VP for Administration, Andrea Buchel at Rutgers. And she said, what's really interesting about uncertainty and ambiguity, and again, this is her comment and not mine, is that with uncertainty, what we crave is more information. But with ambiguity, more information doesn't necessarily help you with your decision making. In fact, it muddies the waters even further. And that was, she said that a couple of weeks ago, and I thought that was brilliant for where we are right now in an ambiguous moment in time. We have all of this information about COVID, but it sometimes doesn't help us.
Thank you. That was great.
Anybody have one more question or share out a comment, or if their dissertation is relative to crisis leadership?
Okay, I guess it's going to be me, Dr. Hammer. Well, I'm just in the very beginning stages right now of, starting this dissertation process. And so, Dr. Hammer is going to be my chair on this dissertation, and it'll be on crisis leadership, but focusing on principles and more specifically looking at even the instructional leadership of how that's being affected during this time of the pandemic. So I'm just getting started. So, getting into the research and the literature. So, and I actually came across one of your articles too. So, that I've already, read. So, and then
Okay.
Dr. Hemmer said, you were going to be here for a lecture, and then we actually have another class. We have a class going on at 7, but our professor let us come to this lecture. So I'm really happy to show.
That's so great. Good luck with the work. I am adding to the chat room here my email address, so I'm always happy to talk more with any of you, especially PhD students who are doing work in crisis and want to bounce around some ideas or hear about obstacles that I encountered with my research to maybe warn you to how to approach this differently. But I'd love to hear about your progress. It's such important work. And for those of you that are engaged in teaching and administration, I wish you all the very best, because this work is noble and important. And my goodness, our society is hungry for values-based leadership, especially at our educational institutions. And thank you, Lynn, for the invitation.
Thank you. I've been looking forward to this for quite a few months. Our paths crossed, just to give you some background history, our paths crossed through a book review I was asked to do for the department chair. And then Ralph reached out, and it's like, oh my goodness, the stars were just aligned. I so enjoyed the book. I share with my students that the work that a colleague and I did, Scott Elliff and I did with superintendents in Hurricane Harvey, I wish I had had the book before that study. So now I want to go back and reinvent how I looked at the data and the questions that we asked, because the book is truly, it doesn't matter that it's in higher education. It does, because it does, but so much of it translates over to other settings. And so thank you for doing the work, and thank you for sharing it with us and for giving us your time this evening.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Yeah. All right, so we're going to go ahead and close out. Thank you, Texarkana, for joining us. We had some folks from far and wide in Texas, I think even outside of Texas. So getting a lot of nice comments in the chat box. Thank you. We'll draw it to a close.